Hatred of women, misogyny, is ingrained in our culture and our society. It's the inevitable consequence of millennia of a system which exists of male domination of women, patriarchy, which is enforced through violence and terror. When we talk about misogyny being ingrained in our culture, we mean the rhetoric, the discourse, the conversations which normalise the violent subjugation of women by men. Now, this brings me to the now notorious article penned by Jeremy Clarkson. Let's just discuss this putrid article. Now, he begins by suggesting Meghan Markle obviously used some vivid bedroom promises to turn Prince Harry into a warrior of woke, itself a misogynistic attempt to portray Markle as a malevolent, manipulative seducer. He goes on to say about Markle that I hate her, not like I hate Nicola Sturgeon or Rose West. I hate her on a cellular level. Now, here he brings up two other women, intentionally lumping the Scottish First Minister, herself on the receiving end of frequent misogynistic bile, in with a notorious serial killer. And then he says, at night I'm unable to speak as I lie there, grinding my teeth and dreaming of the day when she is made to parade naked through the streets of every town in Britain while the crowds chant shame and throw lumps of excrement at her. Now, to be clear, if this isn't clear, and we need to be clear when we're talking about this is a violent, sexualised fantasy. This idea of that he's conjured up and penned down of an obsessive level of hatred, which is what he's there confessing to, there's no other way of interpreting it, to such a degree that he's possessed by this idea, this fantasy of parading a woman of colour naked through the streets where baying mobs scream abuse at her. Now, it's easy to dismiss the Sun newspaper as just a vile rag, which it is, by the way, with a history of demonising, well, you name it really, Muslims, migrants, refugees, gay people, minors, Liverpool fans, as well as objectifying and degrading women. But the Sun is one of the most powerful newspapers in the country. It's read in some form by millions. It has, I'm afraid to say, vast influence. Now, Jeremy Clarkson himself, again, tragically, is one of the most influential personalities in the country, at the heart of the British establishment. He's friends with a former Prime Minister, David Cameron, who he was recently, just before he wrote this article, a few days before, at an elite party hosted by the Queen Consort Camilla Parker Bowles. Now, Jeremy Clarkson has now tweeted, "Oh dear, I'd rather put my foot in it. In a column I wrote about Meghan, I made a clumsy reference to a scene in Game of Thrones, and this has gone down badly with a great many people. I'm horrified to have caused so much hurt, and I shall be more careful in future." Now, that's not even a non-apology. I mean, it's worse than a "I'm sorry if you're offended." When you put your foot in it, you do something awkward, like ask someone how their partner is when you've forgotten or don't know that they split up. Or maybe you get someone's age wrong, you think they're older than they are. A violent sexualised fantasy involving parading a woman of colour through the streets, while excrement is thrown at them with baying mobs screaming at them, is not putting your foot in it. It is actually incitement. And I think this is important to talk about, because it proves everything Meghan Markle has said about the British media correct. Prince Andrew, a close friend of a notorious paedophile, a royal who paid millions of pounds, including from public money, to settle a case with a woman who accused him of sexual abuse, does not attract this level of hatred and bile. Nothing Meghan Markle has done, or is accused of doing, is even on the same level. Her crime is that her and her husband have accused the royal family of not protecting her, well, from the sort of stuff churned out by the likes of Jeremy Clarkson and The Sun, and of holding the British media industry to account for their behaviour. And that's the one thing the cry bullies of the British media do not like. Oh, they will demonise entire groups of people with catastrophic consequence, often for the lives of profoundly marginalised minorities. But when, in this case, they actually fought and took on those who had a platform to fight back, they were infuriated. And they have not ever let that go. And that's why they're so obsessively deranged with hatred. And I think that's an important point to make, because what we're talking about here is radicalisation. Like, Jeremy Clarkson is radicalised. He is, by his own confession, profoundly obsessed. He's convulsed with an obsession, an obsessive hatred, to a degree that he publicly fantasises about violent sexualized forms of humiliation against the object of his hateful obsession. Now, this level of hatred is unhinged, and it does have consequences. As the former head of counter-terrorism, Neil Basu, said, Meghan Markle has faced credible threats to her life. And if you normalise violent fantasies like this, then you help spur on and legitimise those with violent intent. Of course, you read stuff like this in a national newspaper, and you think that this is actually perfectly fine and acceptable, and you may well then feel more emboldened to act on your own hateful obsessions. Now, it doesn't just threaten Meghan Markle. It's important to say, of course, she is the specific target here, and that point has to be made. But it helps normalise the violent treatment of women by men. Now, none of this, of course, can be divorced from the racist as well as sexist treatment of Meghan Markle, a woman of colour who has dared to speak out and now must be terrorised into silence, which is in large part what this is all about. Now, imagine someone had written something like this about a white royal, Kate Middleton, for example. Their career would not just be finished immediately, but they'd be frankly driven out of the country. Like, there was the consequences would be catastrophic if someone had written this about Kate Middleton. And that itself, of course, tells its own story. Now, Jamie Clarkson's daughters condemned her father. She said, my views are and have always been clear when it comes to misogyny, bullying and the treatment of women by the media. I want to make it very clear that I stand against everything that my dad wrote about Meghan Markle, and I remain standing in support of those that are targeted with online hatred. Now, welcome as this is, it doesn't fall to women, including Clarkson's daughter, to take the lead here. What we have to talk about is male complicity. Because, there was that hashtag for a while that sometimes crops up, not all men. It's wrong to hold all men to account for the violence committed against women. Because lots of men say, well, I've never been violent towards a woman, so why should I in any way have any sort of complicity attached to me at all? But you see, all men are beneficiaries of patriarchy to some degree, even if simultaneously, by the way, some men could also be victims of it, like gay men or men struggling with mental health who are made to feel unmanly and don't speak out or can't speak out or seek help for their mental health because of it. Biggest killer of men under 45 is suicide. But you see, the issue about silence being complicity is there is a culture which normalises violence against women, which includes conversations between men which degrade women. Now, unless men speak out against this culture, which all men know exists in their heart of heart, they know that. All men have heard other men talk about women in degrading ways, every single one, including some men who purport to be progressive, then obviously that culture will persist, ensuring the normalisation of male violence against women will remain ingrained in our culture. Across the world, tens of thousands of women are killed each year, murdered by men. I mean, throughout history, how many millions of women have been murdered by men? I mean, in 2017 alone, 80% of all women murdered were murdered, or that the gender was known of those who'd murdered them were killed by men. That's at the extreme end. If you look in Britain, estimates suggest about 1.4 million women suffer domestic violence each year. There are tens of thousands of women sexually assaulted each year. As for sexual harassment, most women have been sexually harassed at some point by men. As well as obviously all the corollaries, whether it be women being overwhelmingly concentrated in the lowest paid work, whether it be women doing the vast majority of unpaid labour, women having to choose between work and families. A society which, despite the struggle of women, particularly over the last, throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, remains a patriarchy. I mean, you can say, we can look at somewhere like Iran and see gender apartheid and the brave women of Iran fighting back and think, well, look, Britain's not like Iran. But patriarchy just in different forms exists in every country and in all normalises violence against girls and women. Now, what Clarkson said is grotesque and he should be regarded with abject contempt. But this is a symptom of a much wider problem that all men have to confront because it is ingrained within our culture. And that's what this has to be about. Not just, obviously objecting to Jeremy Clarkson, whose own history tells its own story, or the Sun newspaper, whose own history tells its own story, but looking at this culture and the consequences of this culture. And that is something which needs profound introspection. It does need men to take a lead about the culture within our own ranks. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you next time.